The smell of damp earth and ripe grapes is my oldest memory. Not toys, not lullabies, but the fertile soil of the Hayes family vineyards. I grew up in the embrace of that landscape, with dirt under my fingernails and a palate sharp enough to pick up on the subtleties of each vintage. By age 7, I could tell a Merlot from a Cabernet Sauvignon just by the aroma. I vividly remember one afternoon, buzzing with an idea, I ran to my great-uncle Percival, who was overseeing the harvest. "Grandpa Percival," I gasped, "what if we tried fermenting some of the grapes in clay amphorae like the ancient Romans? I read in a book that it could give it a more earthy flavor." He looked me up and down, his brown eyes, which to me seemed so wise, now had a hint of condescension. A faint smile played on his lips, the same smile I'd come to hate over time. "Charlotte dear," he replied, his voice soft but firm, "leave the grand ideas to the adults. We have a method that's worked for generations at Hayes & Sons. We don't need kiddie inventions." That day the smell of grapes stopped being pure joy and took on a slightly bitter edge. Now, at 38, that bittersweet taste was pretty much my default. The scene played out in endless ways. We were in the estate's main tasting room, at yet another one of our family get-togethers. My cousin Richard, in his impeccable suit and with that smile that always seemed forced, was droning on about expanding into new Asian markets. My uncles, gathered around the massive oak table, nodded vigorously like well-rehearsed puppets. I, on the other hand, was in charge of making sure the wine glasses were full and the appetizers were perfectly arranged. A minor task, sure, but a constant reminder of my place in the Hayes hierarchy. The organizer, not the strategist. They talked about figures, about logistics, about the future of the brand, but never about the soul of the wine. I could feel the tension in every fiber of my being, an imbalance that had dragged on for years, suffocating my true passion. It wasn't that I didn't want Hayes & Sons to thrive. It was the way they brushed off any contribution from me. My suggestions to invest in sustainable practices, to explore less-known grape varieties, or to revamp the winery's visitor experience were always met with that same Percival smile, condescending and dismissive. As Richard wrapped up his presentation, Percival motioned for me. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up a 1985 bottle, one of our cellar's most iconic wines, to pour. He watched me intently as I poured the ruby liquid into the glass, his eyes boring into mine. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low enough not to be heard by the others, but carrying a gravity that made my stomach churn. "Richard is doing an exceptional job. He has the vision Hayes & Sons needs. He understands the market, the scale of our legacy." I made an effort to stay calm, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the pouring wine. "Yes, Uncle Percival," I replied, my voice as steady as I could make it. "Richard's great with numbers." He took a sip of the wine, pondering, before continuing. "And you, Charlotte, you have good taste, I'll give you that. But passion and good taste by themselves don't make a leader. Hayes & Sons needs someone with more developed leadership skills. Someone with the ability to guide a company of this size on the global stage. You get it, don't you?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. I got it. I perfectly understood what he was telling me, how he saw me, what they expected of me, and, above all, what they didn't expect. The ruby liquid in the glass seemed to turn into bitter poison in my mouth. I looked at him, at the man who represented the entire legacy I was being denied. The pang in my chest wasn't surprise, but a familiar, deep ache. A plan, still shapeless, began to creep into the darkest corners of my mind. I didn't say a word, but my mind was already screaming a silent challenge, a challenge they couldn't even begin to imagine. And what came next would change everything. The invitation to the board meeting had arrived by email, cold and formal. I knew something big was about to go down, but deep down, a stubborn part of me still hoped for some recognition, even a tiny shot. I put on my best blazer, a deep red wine shade that matched the color of the grapes I loved so much, almost like armor. I arrived at the boardroom on time, the click of my heels echoing on the polished marble floor, a stark contrast to the heavy silence already in the room. The oak table was a stage for the serious faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, all already seated except for the head chair, which remained empty. The air was almost thick, laden with expectation and attention I couldn't quite put my finger on. I took my usual discreet spot in the corner of the table and watched. No one greeted me with their usual enthusiasm. Their glances were quick, almost evasive. This day wasn't about family celebrations or the wines we loved, but about the future that would be decided without me. The worst part was how familiar the scene felt. I'd felt this kind of isolation before. Percival finally walked in, his presence filling the room. He didn't need a podium. The room itself seemed to bend to his will. He smiled, a smile I knew well, the same smile he used when he was about to announce something he knew would make waves. He started with the usual rituals. Superficial compliments to the team, a nod to Hayes and Sons' history, a reverence for the legacy. My heart pounded harder, an anxious beat that made me brace for the inevitable. And then he got to the point. As you all know, he began, his grave voice resonating, Hayes and Sons is at a crucial juncture. The market is changing, consumers demand innovation. We need new blood, an impartial vision that can guide us for the next 100 years. He paused dramatically, sweeping the room with his eyes. His gaze lingered on me for a moment, a cold glance that made me stiffen in my chair. With that in mind, the board, in full consensus, has decided to bring in outside talent. Someone with no family ties, no preconceptions. Someone who can truly revolutionize Hayes and Sons. The room murmured. I could feel eyes turning towards me, a mix of pity and curiosity. My cousin Richard, who had been expecting the leadership role for himself, was visibly shocked but managed to keep his poker face. For me, the description was crystal clear. No family ties, no preconceived notions. It was Percival's polite way of saying that I, with all my passion and deep-rooted knowledge, just wasn't good enough. I wasn't trustworthy. I wasn't capable. The humiliation was so thick you could almost taste the metallic tang in my mouth. Then he dropped the name, Arthur Finch. A renowned consultant, sure, but a total stranger to the world of Hayes and Sons, to the very soul of the winery. They were handing over my legacy, my essence, to some nobody. My thoughts were a whirlwind. Years of dedication, nights spent poring over every stage of winemaking, the audacious ideas I'd pitched that were shot down. My passion, the only thing that kept me tied to that family, was treated like some naive hobby. The raw wound felt like it was bleeding internally. A vivid memory of my grandma, who always cheered me on, popped into my head. Your talent, Charlotte, is a gift, she'd say. Now it felt like a curse. I fixed my gaze on Percival, my eyes burning, but my face stayed stone cold. Not a muscle twitched. Not a single tear fell. The pain ran deep, but rage was my shield. They expected a reaction, an outburst, but I'd give them my silence. A silence that would scream louder than any shout. I rose slowly, the chair scraping against the marble. Without a word, without a backward glance, I turned and walked towards the door. My head was held high, but every step echoed like shattered glass in my heart. I knew the door was closing behind me, but what they didn't know was that, by doing so, they were also opening another. A door to a path I'd walk alone. And I wouldn't be coming back. My maternal grandma's cottage, nestled in the hills about an hour's drive from the Hayes vineyards, had always been my sanctuary. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the air smelled of lavender and old wood, and where memories of the only person who truly believed in me seemed to float. After the meeting, that's where I drove, my mind in a whirl and my heart laid bare. With every mile I put between myself and Hayes and Sons, the anger mixed with a sense of emptiness. I'd spent my whole life gearing up for a role that was denied to me with a smug smile. The first few days at the cottage were a blur of pain and sleeplessness. I walked through the empty fields, feeling the sun on my skin, but not its warmth in my soul. I thumbed through enology books my grandma had given me, each page a reminder of what I loved and what I'd lost. One night, as the rain pattered softly against the window, my eyes landed on an old notebook with a faded leather cover. These were my notes from years ago, ideas the Hayes family had dismissed as over the top or not commercially viable. There were sketches of terraced vineyards, research on almost extinct grapes, biodynamic winemaking techniques that seemed heretical to Percival's traditionalism. I read and reread. And for the first time since the humiliation, a spark ignited in me. It wasn't the spark of pure rage but of cold determination. Hayes and Sons wanted new blood and an impartial vision. I'd give them that, but on my own terms. I wouldn't destroy the family's legacy. I'd build a new one so innovative and superior that theirs would look obsolete in comparison. Revenge wouldn't be in tearing them down but in outdoing them. It would be the silent revenge of success. The pain started morphing into fuel. Sadness gave way to laser-sharp clarity. My grandma always used to say that the most fertile ground is the one that recovers from a fire. And I was that ground. I started sketching out a plan. The first step was finding the perfect land, a spot with a unique microclimate, far from any Hayes property, a place they'd never even consider worthy of their legacy. I'd need secrecy, complete discretion. Percival was cunning, and I knew any false move would be detected. I spent weeks immersed in topographical maps, soil charts, and meteorological data. My research led me to a remote area, known only to a few small farmers, a hidden valley tucked behind mountains most people didn't even know existed. It was an untouched place with latent potential, but it would demand unimaginable investment and hard work. My savings would be the starting point, but I'd need more. I began brainstorming how to secure the necessary funding without setting off the family's radar. I remembered old university contacts, professors who had praised my crazy theories and who might be able to point me to people with a more open mind for innovation. I thought about suppliers operating on the fringes of the industry, those who valued quality above a big name. With every search, every discreet phone call, every encrypted email, I felt the plan solidify. It wouldn't be easy, but the satisfaction of building something from scratch, something that would be mine, was a powerful motivator. I was planting a seed, and that seed carried the weight of my ambition and my vindication. But the biggest question was, could I plant this seed without the shadow of Hayes and Sons discovering my secret garden before it blossomed? The days at the cottage morphed into weeks of frantic planning and discreet execution. Every email sent, every call made was a calculated risk. My biggest worry was raising funds without alerting the Hayes family. My personal savings were a good start, but to build a winery from scratch I'd need way more. The solution came from an unexpected place: the family jewels my grandma had left me. They weren't just trinkets but symbols of Hayes and Sons' past, with gems Percival had given me for birthdays, now discreetly sold to fund my future far from them. It was a bittersweet irony but a necessary sacrifice. Each ring and necklace turned into seed money was one more step on my journey to freedom. The money from the jewels gave me the initial capital injection, which allowed me to push forward with researching the land. I didn't want just any soil. I was looking for a terroir that Hayes and Sons, with their traditional mindset, would never dare to explore. My focus landed on an inland region with altitudes and soil compositions that promised wines of unique character, but which demanded very specific cultivation techniques and a hefty initial investment. The property was remote, difficult to access, which was a bonus in terms of discretion. The bureaucratic hurdles were exhausting. Buying land under a pseudonym was a complex maneuver, requiring trusted lawyers and a network of contacts I built with caution. I went with the name Charlotte Vance, a shout-out to my grandma, and operated through a shell company to keep my real name out of it. Every document I signed felt like an act of rebellion, but also a taste of newfound freedom. I was the Charlotte they didn't know, the one pulling strings from the shadows, driven by a quiet determination. Getting a loyal crew on board was key. I tapped into my old enology school network, the folks who shared my vision for innovation and also felt a bit undervalued by the traditional wine industry. I even hired this brilliant but quirky winemaker named Samuel. He'd been fired from a big winery for being too bold. He was the perfect partner for my crazy venture. Our meetings were always on the down low in discreet cafes or at my cabin, with maps and blueprints spread all over the table. The excitement was totally palpable, but we always kept our voices hushed. The tension was a constant companion. I lived on high alert, checking emails, monitoring industry news, always on the lookout for any sign that the Hayes family might be sniffing around trying to figure out where I was or what I was up to. They couldn't know. Not yet. The risk of getting caught was huge, but the adrenaline kept me going. I knew Percival, with his connections, could blow up my project before it even had a chance to breathe. Every bit of progress was a hard-won battle. After months of secret talks and financial gymnastics, the moment finally arrived. The land purchase contract was officially signed. It was a forgotten piece of land with steep slopes and diverse soil that promised complex wines. The landscape was wild and beautiful, untouched by time. But to the Hayes family it would just look like unproductive land, a mistake. For me, it was the birthplace of my silent revenge, the stage where I'd cultivate not just grapes but my own redemption. I looked at the map at the marked spot that was now mine. Hayes and Sons had denied me a place in their legacy, but I was about to build a new one, so audacious that soon, they wouldn't be able to ignore its existence. What they didn't know was that the seeds of my triumph were already planted. While I was out sweating in the isolated valley transforming virgin land into a future vineyard, Hayes and Sons, just as I imagined, started feeling the first tremors. They weren't earthquakes yet, but small cracks in the foundation of their arrogance. Their external consultant, Arthur Finch, promised modernity and efficiency. What he actually delivered were cuts. Cuts in R&D investments, cuts to experienced staff's pay, and worst of all, cuts in grape quality. I knew all about it through my network of contacts quietly built up over the years. Disgruntled employees, suppliers I still kept on the hush-hush, all told me the same story. Arthur Finch was all about quick results, numbers on paper, not the soul of the wine. Grapes were being harvested too early to cut labor costs. Long-term partnerships with small growers which guaranteed quality were being ditched for big suppliers offering lower prices. I'd hear the reports and a cold smile would spread across my face. They traded my insufficient talent for empty efficiency. On my own project, the Silence Winery, a name I picked for obvious reasons, the work was tough but super rewarding. The land was challenging, but Samuel, my quirky winemaker, was a genius. Together, we hand-picked rare grape cuttings I'd been researching for years. Forgotten varieties with unique resistance and flavor profiles perfect for the valley's microclimate. Every vine planted was an act of faith, an investment in my vision. I oversaw every step from soil prep to installing the innovative irrigation systems I'd designed myself. The contrast between my dedication and the growing sloppiness at Hayes and Sons was stark. The first whispers about the drop in Hayes wine quality started circulating in the industry press. Articles with headlines like, "Where did Hayes and Sons lose its touch?" and "The Finch Era. Profits at the expense of legacy?" popped up in magazines and online forums. My aunts and uncles, of course, were fuming. I could just picture the meetings, the finger-pointing, the scramble for a scapegoat that wasn't Percival himself or his decision to hire Arthur Finch. They were too arrogant to admit they'd made a colossal blunder by ignoring me and, even worse, handing their empire over to a stranger with no passion for wine. I remember a casual call with my Aunt Meredith who, unknowingly, spilled the beans. She was complaining about the mess Finch had created, the disrespect for traditions. In the middle of the conversation, almost as an aside, she blurted out, "Percival is even criticizing your absence, Charlotte. Says you ran away from the problems as if we weren't the ones who pushed you away." That phrase, a whisper of injustice, ignited a cold flame inside me. Run away. I was secretly building an empire while they watched theirs crumble. The irony was almost sweet. One day, as Samuel and I were debating vine spacing, I got an email. It was from an old Hayes and Sons grape supplier I'd kept in touch with. He told me that my cousin Lucas had reached out asking about strange new demands for certain rare grape varieties, the very ones I was growing. Lucas had brushed off the idea quickly, thinking it was a miscommunication, but the seed of doubt was planted. It was a subtle reminder that even operating in the shadows, I needed to be invisible because my family's curiosity, if piqued, could unearth my project. My secret, if discovered too soon, would be my undoing. The news put me on high alert. Lucas, the cousin who'd always subtly rivaled me, was sniffing something out even if he didn't know what. The possibility of him or Percival discovering Silence before the right time was a risk I couldn't take. I needed to act, to create a smokescreen, a diversion. They still didn't know what I was building, but the shadow of my absence was already starting to unsettle them. And I'd do whatever it took to keep them in the dark until the perfect moment for my rise. The valley housing Silence was buzzing. The first cuttings, imported with such care and secrecy, were planted. Seeing the small vines lined up, each one a promise, filled my chest with a satisfaction that Hayes and Sons could never give me. It was like watching a dream materialize on fertile ground. Samuel and I spent entire days in the vineyards discussing spacing, pruning, and the nuances of the soil. Every decision was made with passion and knowledge, free from the shadow of traditionalism or the hunt for quick profits that had dominated my previous life. But like any good harvest, there were pests to fight. And my most dangerous vine came in human form. My cousin Julian. He wasn't as obvious as Percival nor as ambitious as Richard. Julian was subtle, observant, and always had a curiosity that bordered on nosiness. I found out from an old college buddy that he'd been asking about me, real casual-like at industry events, wanting to know where I was and what I was up to. He even dropped in on some of my old suppliers who luckily were loyal to me and kept mum. My long absence from my old social circle, my lack of contact with family, was an open invitation for speculation. I needed to act to create a diversion, before Julian connected the dots and uncovered my hideout and worse, the Silencio winery. My cunning, which they so underestimated, would be my greatest weapon. I decided to plant a red herring, something that would keep me busy, somewhere other than the valley. I set up a low-key profile on an online agricultural consulting platform, focusing on soil recovery projects. I posted some old photos of myself working in vineyards in Italy from back when I studied there, and wrote vague articles about the importance of renewal and forgotten terroir. The goal was for Julian or whoever else was sniffing around to find this info and conclude that I'd become a traveling consultant, globetrotting on fleeting projects. It was just true enough to be believable but false enough to keep me safe. The bait worked. In a few weeks, I got an anonymous message on my consulting profile, asking about my recent travels, and if I had plans to return to the local industry. It was Julian. I replied with calculated ambiguity, mentioning a hypothetical project in some distant corner of the world and the freedom consulting offered me. He seemed satisfied and the questions died down. But the experience served as a wake-up call. Constant caution was essential. I was operating in a danger zone. The bigger problem, however, came from within. Robert, one of the workers I'd hired to plant the saplings, was a good, hard-working man. But his wife was sick and he needed extra cash. He started asking too many questions, commenting on the winery's weird location and the curiosity of folks in the neighboring town. Worse, he mentioned he'd done a gig for one of my cousins, Richard, transporting some wine boxes a few months back, and that Richard had asked about new people in the area. There was no indication Robert would intentionally betray me, but he was a weak link, a dangerous connection that could jeopardize everything. It was one of the toughest decisions I've ever made. Firing Robert meant taking food out of his family's mouths, but keeping him was a risk I couldn't afford to take. With a heavy heart, but a cold, strategic mind, I sat down with him and, as gently as I could, let him go, paying him a hefty sum so he'd have time to get back on his feet and with the promise of a glowing recommendation. He didn't fully understand, but he accepted. In that moment, I realized that to protect my secret and Silencio, I'd have to make tough choices, some of them morally ambiguous. And the cost of a silent revenge, I knew, might be higher than I'd imagined. Winter brought a new phase for Silencio. The young grapevines, now protected by the soil and the constant care of Samuel and me, awaited spring. The cottage was bustling more with the smaller, fiercely loyal team I'd handpicked after Robert's departure. The cost of that decision still weighed on me, but the project's security was paramount. I was becoming more and more of a fortress. However, the tranquility was a fragile illusion. The internal crisis cropped up where I least expected it, from my side. One of my first investors, Mark, an old college buddy I considered a friend who had bet on my crazy idea, when no one else would, was acting weird. He'd reached out with excessive enthusiasm, wanting to discuss the wine's launch before it was even ready. Something was off. The truth came through Sarah, a wine journalist and a loyal informant I'd cultivated over the years. She called me, her voice laced with worry. "Charlotte, I've heard some strange rumors," she began, hesitant. "It seems Mark is sounding out some smaller Hayes & Sons competitors, offering info about a new and promising winery project upstate, with promises of partnerships and privileged access to a revolutionary wine." Sarah didn't know the project was mine, but the description was unmistakable. Mark was using Silencio as leverage, trying to inflate his own value in the market, maybe hoping for a seat at a bigger table, or a quick return on his initial investment. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. Betrayal. And from someone I trusted. Anger bubbled up, but it was quickly replaced by a calculating coldness. There was no time for emotions. I needed to contain the damage before Hayes & Sons, already weakened, used this info to discredit Silencio, or worse, tried to sabotage my project. My strategy was quick and surgical. Instead of confronting Mark directly, I used him. The info was already leaking, so I'd control the flow. I put together a concise, but impactful presentation about Silencio's philosophy, without mentioning the exact location or the project's full scale. I included some artistic photos of the young saplings and the valley, focusing on innovation and sustainability, concepts the Hays ignored but which were hot in the market. I sent this presentation to a few strategic press contacts, with an enigmatic note about a secret, innovative project about to redefine the future of wine. I gave the press what Mark was trying to sell, but in a controlled way and without compromising the essence of my secret. The articles that followed were curious. Silencio Winery, a whisper promising to revolutionize oenology, and The Enigma of the Hidden Valley, the new era of sustainable wine were some of the headlines. The attention was focused on the quality of the idea, on the innovation, not on my identity. Mark, unknowingly, had become my unwitting messenger. He thought he was cashing in on my secret, but I turned him into a tool to create controlled buzz, an anticipation that would strengthen Silencio when it finally came to light. This whole mess has left me wiped out but also tougher and, weirdly enough, more on my own. I'd gotten over a friend's betrayal, proving to myself that I could bounce back from anything. But that whole experience also stuck a layer of skepticism deep inside me. If someone as close as Mark could stab me in the back, who could I really trust? The wine world was a total swamp of shady dealings, and I was learning to navigate it solo with my smarts and a cool head as my guides. Silencio was growing, but the price of its success seemed to be my own loneliness. While Silencio was starting to make waves in the fancy wine media, even without me showing my face, Hays & Sons was going downhill fast. The quiet whispers in the market turned into scathing newspaper articles and heated debates on wine critic forums. Hays & Sons, a giant that lost its way, the fall of quality, the price of bad innovation were just a couple of examples. The reputation that took generations to build was crumbling under the weight of Arthur Finch's decisions and Percival's cluelessness. Sales were plummeting. It wasn't just about minor tweaks anymore. It was a financial bloodbath. The much-hyped external consultant, Arthur Finch, who was supposed to be the family's savior, was predictably the first one to get the boot. I got the news by email, a leaked internal memo announcing his amicable departure. It was just a formality, I knew. He'd been fired, and his exit was a quiet admission of the disaster he helped cook up. But the damage was already done. Hays & Sons' image was trashed, and the wine market, which values tradition and consistent quality so much, doesn't easily forgive. The family was in a total meltdown. My Aunt Meredith, who used to complain about my quirks, was now calling me sporadically not to gossip, but to vent about the family squabbles, the veiled accusations at Sunday lunches that turned into battlefields. My cousin Richard, the ideal successor, looked pale and pissed off, his ambition shaken by the crisis. They were blaming each other, pointing fingers, but no one dared to directly challenge Percival. The patriarch, once so imposing, seemed to be aging by the day. His voice, which used to bark orders with unquestionable authority, was now softer, almost a whisper. I watched from a distance like a scientist observing an experiment. Silencio was thriving, a stark contrast. My grapevines were flourishing. The land Percival considered useless was proving to be extraordinary. Every vine was a reminder of my own growth, my own ability to overcome rejection. While they were sinking into despair, I felt the rise, the fruit of my silent labor. The tension at Hays & Sons culminated in an emergency board meeting, which for some reason Richard thought I should know about. Maybe he hoped I'd feel sorry for them, or maybe he wanted me to witness their ruin. I didn't go, of course, but I got the lowdown from Meredith, who was clearly shaken. She described an unrecognizable Percival hunched over the oak table, his hands trembling. He was desperate, Charlotte, Meredith said, her voice choked up. They discussed selling off parts of the vineyard, taking out a massive loan that would cripple generations. His pride, it was shattered. The mere mention of selling land, something unthinkable for the Hays family, showed just how deep a hole they were in. Percival, the guardian of the legacy, was on the verge of tearing the family history to shreds. Meredith paused and her voice dropped even lower, almost a wail. At the end of the meeting, when everyone was pretty much giving up, Percival looked at the empty chair where you used to sit. He mumbled something. Something about how you would have had better ideas. How you would have known what to do to prevent this. He almost lamented your absence. Those words echoed in my mind long after I hung up. Charlotte would have had better ideas. The irony was brutal. They denied me, cast me aside as not good enough, and now at rock bottom he remembered the better ideas. He had no clue how much those better ideas were already planted, growing in secret, ready to blossom and perhaps become the only salvation for the Hayes and Sons legacy. And the game I knew was just starting to turn. Spring arrived, and with it what seemed impossible: the first full harvest from Vinicolo Silencio. The valley that was once forgotten now radiated life, the grapevines bursting with clusters that promised something truly special. The aroma wafting from the cellar was unlike anything I'd ever smelled at Hayes and Sons. It was the essence of unrestricted work, of unbridled passion, distilled into every drop. Samuel and I spent hours there, tasting, adjusting, until the wine reached the perfection I'd dreamed of. The decision of how to launch Silencio was strategic. Releasing it on the traditional market would mean going head-to-head with the Hayes name, in a marketing and distribution battle they could still manipulate. I didn't want a direct confrontation. I wanted undeniable validation. That's why I chose the Bordeaux International Wine Competition. Known for its blind and impartial judging, it was the perfect stage. There the name didn't matter, only the liquid in the glass. My wine would speak for itself, and victory would be my loudest voice. The preparations for the competition were meticulous. Every bottle of Silencio was inspected, labeled discreetly, just the winery name and the vintage year, without any mention of producer or detailed origin. Anxiety consumed me, a mix of nerves and excitement I'd never experienced before. I wasn't just presenting a wine, I was putting years of contempt, of secret work, and of unwavering faith on the line. Silencio failed, everything I had built, the sacrifice and the solitude, would be for nothing. The irony of the situation was almost palpable. As I finalized the details for the trip to Bordeaux, I found out that Hayes and Sons would also be sending their wines to the competition. In their desperation for rehabilitation, they hoped an award could restore their tarnished reputation. Percival, in his blind pride, still believed that the family name on its own carried enough weight to overcome any recent quality blips. He had no idea that he'd be competing not just against other renowned producers, but against his own black sheep. It was like my silent revenge was about to sit at the same table as them, without them even realizing it. I rolled into Bordeaux, this super vibrant and historic city, with the Silencio bottles tucked safe and sound in their special cases. The vibe at the competition was absolutely electric. Winemakers from all corners of the globe, famous critics, everyone was there, all gunning for the next big thing. On tasting day the bottles were laid out, no labels, just a code. The judges at their own tables were sniffing, sipping, and dissecting with this almost sacred seriousness. I was right there, just another face in the crowd, soaking in every reaction, every flicker of expression on the tasters' faces. I watched one of the most respected judges in the world, a guy with a legendary palate, pick up a glass of what I knew was Silencio. He swirled it, took a whiff, and his eyes widened just a touch. He took a sip, and this unmistakable look of surprise washed over his face, followed by a subtle smile. He jotted something down on his sheet, and I felt this chill run down my spine. Other judges started whispering amongst themselves, pointing at the glass, their voices low but their gestures lively. It was crystal clear that this wine was making waves. The seed I'd planted with so much pain and effort seemed to finally be blooming. And the world was about to get a taste. The air in the grand hall of the competition was thick with electrifying anticipation. Producers, critics, and enthusiasts were packed in, waiting for the winners to be announced. I was there, just another anonymous face in the throng, my heart doing a frantic drum solo against my ribs. The smaller categories were announced and applause filled the room. But I only had eyes for the main prize, the grand gold, the ultimate validation I'd been chasing. When the MC grabbed the mic to announce the best red wine of the year, the place went absolutely silent. And the winner is... He dragged out a dramatic pause that felt like an eternity. Silencio, Vintage 20XX. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. Samuel, who was next to me, squeezed my arm hard, his eyes gleaming. I couldn't even breathe right. It was real. Silencio had won. That forgotten patch of land, the rare grapes, the innovative techniques, it had all paid off. The producer reveal came next. And behind this masterpiece, the vision and dedication of Charlotte Hayes. My name echoed through the hall. This time the murmur turned into a loud buzz, almost a shock. I saw some critics stand up trying to spot me in the crowd. Their faces showed disbelief, followed by a stampede of journalists heading my way. I was practically shoved onto the stage, the lights blinding my eyes, camera flashes popping all around me. I took the trophy, heavy and gleaming, and held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. My voice was choked up, but I managed to stammer out my gratitude, dedicating the win to my grandma and to the guts it took to go after the uncharted. The news spread like wildfire. In the hours that followed, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Interview requests from every major wine and business publication around the globe. Rebel Hayes uncorks winning wine, from black sheep to stardom. Charlotte Hayes' silent ascent. Those headlines were already plastered across digital news sites. The story behind Silencio Winery. The woman underestimated by her own family who built an empire from scratch in secret. That was the narrative everyone wanted. As I gave interviews, my mind drifted to Hayes and Sons. I pictured the scene at their winery headquarters. They were probably watching the broadcast. Percival, Richard, Julian, all of them glued to the screen, seeing my name and my winery's name get all the accolades. The contrast was brutal. While Silencio shone bright in the Bordeaux spotlight, Hayes and Sons was sinking deeper into the shadows of their own complacency. I could almost feel the shock, the humiliation hitting them, the penny finally dropping about the monumental screw-up they'd made. This silent revenge wasn't a scream. It was an explosion of recognition. And I, Charlotte Hayes, was front and center. I got a text from Meredith who, despite everything, always had a soft spot for me. The message was short, just one word: wow. But I knew what she meant. She was a witness to the chaos. The media was already buzzing about how Hayes and Sons, once a powerhouse, would react to their renegade daughter's rise. They had pushed me to the edge, but without meaning to, they'd given me wings. And now I was flying high while they looked up, stumped and humbled. The real battle, though, wasn't over. The win in Bordeaux was a game-changer. Silencio wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a roar in the wine world. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with emails and calls from investors, distributors, and the press, all dying to be part of the phenomenon. But among the hundreds of contacts, a few names stood out, persistent, almost desperate. The Hayes family. The first was from Richard, a formal email asking for an urgent meeting to discuss future collaborations. I ghosted him. Then came Julian with a more personal message, practically begging for coffee. I deleted it. But Percival's attempts were the most relentless. First dry emails, then calls to my chalet number which he shouldn't even have, and finally voicemails. His voice, once so authoritative, now sounded fragile, almost unrecognizable. Charlotte, his voice gravelly in the voicemail, we need to talk. It's about the winery. The situation is complicated. Please call me back. It was a plea, not an order. With each new message, the desperation became more obvious. The press was covering the Hayes and Sons crisis with the same intensity they were celebrating Silencio. Reports of plummeting sales, stalled expansion projects, and even speculation about imminent bankruptcy. They were hitting rock bottom. And I, the black sheep, the no talent, was watching it all unfold from the best seat in the house. I didn't answer. I kept my strategic silence. I let Percival's persistence become a self-inflicted humiliation. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the rejection he'd heaped on me. I wanted him to know what it was like to be ignored, underestimated, cast aside. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was cold and calculated, seasoned with years of bitterness. His persistence got unbearable. One afternoon, as I was reviewing soil samples with Samuel in the vineyard, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I had a hunch it was him. I answered. "Charlotte, it's me, Percival." His voice was hoarse. "I know you're busy, but we need to meet. Somewhere discreet. Please." I hesitated. The idea of seeing him again, of looking into the eyes of the man who had crushed my dreams for so long, was painful. But it was also irresistible. It was time for the power shift. "Coffee in the city next Tuesday, 2 o'clock. Don't be late," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, and hung up before he could even respond. The coffee shop was small and almost empty. Percival was already there when I arrived, slumped at a corner table looking utterly defeated. He seemed to have aged years, his once fiery eyes now showing a deep weariness, his white hair thinner. The imposing aura was gone, replaced by a vulnerability I never thought I'd see. He stood when he saw me, a gesture of respect that made me lift my chin. "Charlotte," he began, his voice shaky, "thanks for coming. I know you don't owe me a thing." He swallowed hard. I screwed up. A terrible mistake. When I said you didn't have the chops to lead, I was dead wrong. Completely wrong. Now, Hayes and Sons is paying the price for my arrogance." He paused, staring at his trembling hands on the table. "I don't know how we're gonna get out of this, Charlotte. The debts, the reputation. It's a train wreck. I came to you because you're the only one who can save us. Your wine. Silence. It's magnificent. It's everything Hayes and Sons should have been and wasn't. But I'm begging you. Please, Charlotte. Help us. Save the family legacy." His words, the plea in his voice, echoed in the small cafe. The man who'd dismissed me, who'd crushed my dreams, was now there, practically on his knees. The satisfaction I felt was immense, but it wasn't the cruel satisfaction I'd imagined. It was a quiet victory, a long overdue recognition. I looked at him, at my great uncle's face, and saw not just his desperation, but the reflection of everything I'd overcome. The power had shifted, and the decision to save or not save what was left of the Hayes and Sons legacy was now entirely in my hands. Percival's plea hung in the air, an echo of my own past pain. I looked at him, at the man who had ostracized me, and realized that revenge wasn't the driving force anymore. It wasn't about making him suffer, but about rewriting history, not out of spite, but for justice and recognition. My position of power was undeniable. I was no longer the black sheep, but the potential savior. "I'll help Hayes and Sons," I said, and the voice that came out was calm and measured, without a trace of triumph or resentment. "But not the way you're thinking, Percival." He looked up, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "Anyway, Charlotte, whatever it takes. My conditions are clear," I continued, and for the first time Percival just listened. "Hayes and Sons will undergo a complete overhaul. That means leadership will be mine. Not a collaboration, not a council. I'll be the main decision-maker. My entire vision, which you rejected for years, will be implemented. Sustainable practices, new grape varieties, brand modernization, everything." His gaze became a mix of relief and surprise, but there was no room for argument anymore. He had seen what my insufficient talent was capable of creating. "And Vinícola Silencio?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Silence will remain independent," I replied. "It will be living proof of what can be achieved when talent is free. But its resources, its expertise, they can benefit Hayes and Sons. Under my direction, of course." Percival nodded slowly, a weight seemingly lifted from his hunched shoulders. There were no more excuses, just acceptance. That day, in an unassuming coffee shop, the Hayes and Sons legacy was redefined, not by destruction, but by a power shift that honored the past while embracing a future I had secretly forged. It wasn't a public humiliation, but a silent recognition, a triumph that resonated in every fiber of my being. In the following months, Hayes and Sons began its slow but necessary transformation. It was a challenging process. There was resistance, of course, especially from Richard and Julian, but Percival's word was law, and my reputation, solidified by Silence's victory, was unassailable. I implemented the changes I'd dreamed of for years, introducing new techniques, revamping the vineyards with more resilient varieties adapted to climate change, and most importantly, cultivating a culture of innovation and respect within the company. Those who once ignored me now sought my guidance. Silence remained my sanctuary, my dream laboratory, the place where pure passion for wine flourished without restrictions. I spent more time there, cultivating the grapes that were the essence of my freedom and my personal victory. On a sunny afternoon, with the sun setting over the hills of my valley, I held a glass of Silence, the golden light reflecting in the amber liquid. Percival called me, his voice full of gratitude. Hayes and Sons sales were starting to bounce back, and critics were praising the winery's bold new direction. He thanked me, admitting I had saved Hayes and Sons from certain doom. But the real success wasn't what he saw in the balance sheets. I raised my glass, toasting the sun. My grapes, my passion, my path. The value Percival and the Hayes family once denied was now undeniable. Not because I proved it to them but because I proved it to myself. The harvest of overcoming was sweeter than any revenge. It was proof that true talent, when nurtured with determination and strategy, always finds its way to bloom, no matter how deep the darkness of the seed.